speeches, so I'll be leaving 1 minute, 7 minute, and 8 minute timestamps in the chat. But in case I forget or miss them or I'm not quite precise, please do make sure you're timing yourself, or one of your teammates is timing you as well, just so you have an idea of how long your speech has been going on. Speakers are requested and encouraged to introduce themselves and their gender pronouns and how they'd like to be referred to at the beginning of their speeches. Other speakers are requested to please respect those preferences and make sure not to make anybody feel unsafe or uncomfortable with any of their remarks. And finally, if you have any particular BOI preferences for how you'd like to receive BOIs, please mention that in the beginning of your speech as well. And once again, speakers in the other team, please respect that. I also expect, of course, everybody to try to take BOIs where possible. Do remember it's an engaging format. In the event that a speaker doesn't raise any preferences for how they'd like to be asked BOIs, I would recommend just asking in the chat rather than unmuting yourself because it's usually less disruptive. All right, great. With that all said and done, I now invite the Prime Minister of the House. Could you record this round? This is up to everybody else, so I'm going to ask both. So this, who is asking? This is prop asking, right? Yeah, okay. Op consents. Cool. Just making sure everybody consents. There's nobody here who's not consenting. I'll give somebody a few seconds if they want to not consent to recording. Okay, seeing no objection, I think we're fine with that. You're welcome to go ahead and record. Wonderful. With that, I call upon the Prime Minister of the House to open the debate.
Hi, can I check if I'm audible? All right, thank you. So my POI preferences verbally, I will not be checking the chat. And without further ado, I will be beginning my speech. Has the recording started?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. 9 years ago, the world reached a historic deal, with the 195 countries signing the Paris Climate Agreement, truly united in tackling climate change for the first time, and yet it was deemed weak. Chronically lacking in incentive, should a country choose to leave it, nobody could have stopped them. What proposition uniquely brings here today is a far simpler tool, one that can both incentivize countries to join and stay in the system, and one which also benefits the most vulnerable of all developing nations. So proud to propose. So I'll be doing two things in my speech. I will first be explaining our mechanism in today's debate, and secondly, I'll be folding an argument on the combating climate change. Our setup is a 5-point setup, meaning I will start with my model, which is firstly, we think that it's possible to run a cap and trade system where a carbon cap limit will be put on all these industries so that they can't produce past that set limit. Each company will have a fixed carbon cap in which they can choose to save and for it to be sold to other countries in the global green market. Then we think that this money is able to help the country either in green technology or sustainable measures. We think we won't immediately cap them. We start off like high and slowly transition to like down over the years. Maybe like in year one it will be 100 tons, and then year two it will 80 tons. By year five it will be 0 tons of carbon emissions. Then this is better for companies for two reasons. Firstly, that they have the time to research and invest in, develop, buy green stuff, energy stuff, etc. Secondly, the financial cost is not as high as one-time thing. If they are given notice in advance, it's better for the cash flow, right? They are more likely to adopt it then. The bottom line here is that we protect the poor, vulnerable countries that can't afford to spend $100 billion overnight. Secondly, then, we also think that the cap limit relies on the industry average, meaning like aviation industries such as an aviation conglomerates like AHL or like Cathay Pacific will have significantly stricter caps like the food industries such as McDonald's and KFC, because it doesn't require much of an emission to like farm rice or to like produce French fries. Then, even though it might be based on the industry average, we think that the amount of cap allocated would still be based on how much it still needs to be less than the status quo in order for climate change to be reduced. Then, thirdly, here on the fact that the carbon cap will be based on the amount of carbon emitted, basically how much carbon emissions we need to eliminate to make a significant impact of reducing climate change rates. The metric used for determining the different carbon caps for each company would be based on like the GDP and like the size of the company, right? Even if these companies were to undergo some sort of financial struggle, they have the option to sell their permits given by the government yearly to other less developed corporations that need it during the that needs it during the transition to clean energy. This is effective since like less developed companies rely on cheap fossil fuel usage, and it's expected that they will have a higher time transitioning to green energy, meaning they require more permits so that they can develop their company to a point where they can afford transitioning into like green energy. Then fourthly, this will be a global environmental pact, right, which is important because countries sign this to join this environment the agreement, which will be policed through traditional international checks and balances, i.e., international bodies such as UNSDG. Any means of lobbying and exploitation will not work then due to the transparency of the international grounds. Fifth, and lastly, we think that there will be a punishment implemented into this system. That is to, if companies do exceed their carbon limit, we take a hardline stance and make it so that these companies will receive some sort of severe punishment to deter them from ever doing this again, i.e., revoking their license and making it hard to get a new one, revoking their business's license then, right? So before I move on to my argument, I'll take a POI. 3, 2, 1. Moving on to my argument then on how companies are incentivized to combat climate change in the instance where there is carbon cap imposed. 5 layers to this. I think firstly on the premise here, we think this argument runs on the simple logic of stakeholders feeling incentivized more by the carbon cap as opposed to the big warnings of like happening in the next 30 years, also that the activists usually flash out in public. Why is this premise usually true here? Some comparatives as to why the urgency metric isn't fulfilled in status quo. Firstly, on the long-term threats, companies are likely to not care about the effects of climate change as long as they do not feel a direct impact of it. The reason is twofold. When you see a poster outlining the impacts that are bound to materialize you down the next 50 years, you're not as inclined to commit to them because you can always procrastinate and say, there's still 5 more decades for humanity to work on this problem then, right? Secondly, corporations' incentives are usually outweighed by greediness, right? Obviously, where they delude themselves and assume that there is still a lot of time to reverse the impacts of climate change, there is literally no reason for companies to stop profiting off pollution. Secondly, on things like public and activism and backlash, let's assume that there is some substantial amount of public backlash, right? We think that companies can easily mitigate it via greenwashing, where they make superficial changes or publicize small environmentally friendly initiatives to appear more sustainable and appealing towards consumers, while continuing harmful practices that would continue to worsen the environment on opposition side of the house. What's the delta then on proposition? We tell you that we motivate these corporations to combat carbon emissions, right? Simply because there is a limit to the cap as to how much carbon is emitted, companies will be scared to emit the carbon because they know their license will get revoked. When you lower the amount of the carbon that they produce, when you lower the amount of credit that they get, they necessarily are forced to lower the amount of carbon. But note that since it's not slow and low, that won't directly harm them. It just serves as a check and balance for them. But from an economic standpoint here, right? As for the developed nations, they probably want to be environmental bastions. That is to say that there are external factors such as upholding their reputation on the global scale and international political pressure, i.e., UK being coerced by the USA to adopt this policy. Secondly, as for developing nations, carbon capping also to forward some sort of economic markets towards them. Developing nations want to have leverage over powerful countries in terms of development. Therefore, they can utilize things like carbon credit, i.e., Uganda selling, no thank you, Uganda selling carbon credits to rich kind of companies in the West. Right? So what are the bottom line impacts of this? 2 impacts then. Firstly, on the fact that proposition manages to tackle the climate change simply because we turn it into an economic incentive for these companies. Carbon emissions have been capped to a level that's deemed to be environmentally safe and has been set to generally decrease over a period of time. Simply because these countries are profit incentivized, we think that they'll likely comply with this. This means that it's not like an instant change. We think that we can prevent these measures from like the climate from worsening, which looks like the climate increasing by 1.5 Celsius and having no way back and increase of climate refugees and other problem. Secondly, then, we tell you that it's important in an economic standpoint too, because proposition is able to incentivize these companies to lower their carbon profit in order to gain some carbon emission in order to gain profits. Then, note that companies are profit incentivized. If they can earn extra money, even if it is little, they would not mind trading in for this little usage of carbon that they can decrease on, which is a win-win situation. Why would other methods not work then? we tell you that other methods don't work, such as like the Paris Accords, because which was clearly proven to be ineffective, and like the taxing on these companies, which will be detrimental on developing countries because they do not have the capacity to afford it, causing a far worse chain reaction in the economy. This just generally proves that our other methods isn't just fast and useful enough, which is the comparative that we would like to draw. For all these reasons, so proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech. Just a reminder to everybody, please respect the speaker's POI preferences. So if somebody has said to put them in the chat, please put them in the chat. Unmuting yourself could become disruptive for the speaker. All right, let's try to avoid that in future. Okay, now to begin the case for the opposition, I call upon the leader of the opposition. Here.
Hi, can I be seen and heard?
Yep.
My preferred pronouns are she, her, and I'll take POIs verbally because I'll not be checking chat. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Judge, this policy doesn't guarantee us a greener world. It is flawed and privatized on the rich and the large industries. We oppose. Two arguments that I'll be talking about in my speech today. One, why other nations are less likely going to buy into green technologies to begin with. And second, why the mandation of this policy is counterproductive. Before that, a couple points of setup just down the bench here. Firstly, what is our model? A, we're going to implement alternative approaches. We would implement performance-based regulations where we give companies awards in the form of compensation of cash or credits when they exceed or meet the target on the limit of emissions that they produce to incentivize them to maintain this use of green energy in the future. And B, since carbon pricing is still going to exist under our side of the house, we're only going against the mandation of it. What will this result in? Two things. One, the states will have the freedom to choose whether to implement this carbon pricing or not, in the sense that different areas have different capabilities and markets, and thus it is unjustified to implement a quote-unquote one-size-fits-all policy for the sake of environmental protection, which we would like to posit is severely lacking on side proposition either way. Two, we get better incentive to reduce carbon emissions because we fulfill a principle of choice and authenticity of incentive, in which we're able to obtain more industries to willingly switch to greener technology, as opposed to forcing them to do so, only to end up with unsustainable short-term benefits. Secondly, on clarifications. A, we think that when large corporations who emit the most GHG and are notorious for lobbying and influencing governments to their benefit, and when they're actually eager to integrate carbon pricing into their practices over other strategies, then it's evident that this system is flawed. And B, further, I also want to highlight, Judge, that you simply cannot use profits and monetary gain as an incentive to be greener, because that itself does not align with the principle of saving the environment. Before my argument, direct responses on their point on how it's going to increase economic incentive of these profit-oriented companies. Recognize, Judge, that the only way to change profit-oriented companies under proposition side is to make carbon pricing so expensive that it actually is going to affect their economy and their capital, but in turn realize that it just builds up into two major harms for their team. One, you allow for large industries in developed countries to monopolize other companies in developing countries, where they can just dominate the entire industry. And two, because of this monopolization, other industries are actually going to have an active skepticism towards these companies. That is to say, that it's unlikely that they even want to adopt this policy to begin with. Which leads me to my argument on first, why industries are less likely going to buy into green technology to begin with. Let's dissect this first argument threefold. Firstly, we posit that this policy is going to be enacted by a group that has the power to mandate other nations and other countries to do so, which is likely going to be the UN or the UNEP. Then, we posit that the UNEP is actually dominated by Western nations, so it's unclear why the developing states or countries all around the world are going to agree with this policy in the first place. Why do we think so? Simply because the most developing countries that exploit the environment, such as the countries in the Middle East, countries in Yemen, Iran, have an active skepticism towards Western countries. The reason being colonialism, or because how up until now these countries are still intervening with like their country's domestic policies. This looks like the US still intervening with Afghanistan and still sending troops to combat the Taliban, for example. In that regard, developing countries are unlikely going to want to execute this policy under both sides of the house anyway when they are forced. Second, note that majority of the green technology we have today literally comes from Chinese and Western companies like Tesla and etc. That means when developing countries are forced to change their policy to a more environmentally friendly policy, is going to lead to a surge in demand for these green technologies. The demand for these technologies, then, Judge, will shift to a mainstream market, i.e., the Chinese and Western companies being the sole providers of this technology. Why do you think this is likely to happen? Two things. One, developing countries may lack the necessary skilled workforce or the financial resources to develop their own green technology industries. Or two, it's inherently much more expensive and risky to try and create new technology which releases less emissions. So they opt into buying other companies' products. This gives us two harmful outcomes, Judge. A, countries will soon be too reliant on imports from Chinese and Western countries. So B, these companies are likely going to exploit the dependence of these developing countries because they have the power to dictate prices and the terms of trade, just so it can align with their own interests in increasing their short-term gains and profits, right? Understand that this makes other countries incredibly vulnerable to price fluctuations. So thirdly, when developing countries are forced to change and be mandated to this carbon taxing, countries that are the forefront of sustainable energy, being the main and only source of this green technology, can in turn add to the likelihood of them monopolizing other industries and markets. This looks like a few things then. A, they can use their power to participate in setting industry standards to ensure that their technologies become the dominant choice. Or B, carbon pricing will create volatility in markets. This not only affects consumers, Judge, but also businesses, since costs will be so unpredictable. I.e., the European Union's emissions trading system literally faced criticism for price volatility, which literally led to inadequate incentives for other industries to reduce emissions. So exactly because of these things, Judge, other countries are very likely going to question the dominant country's ulterior motives, and simply because they will see how these providers are just trying to monopolize their own industries and markets. It's unlikely that they will want to follow the policy in the first place. So why then is this case more important compared to proposition? Realize how this argument is a major tipping point in the debate, because proposition's case is contingent on the trust that people have in these companies and the policy itself. So the fact that we've proven to you why it's likely that individuals will not buy into green technology in the future to begin with washes out their case. Moving on to the second argument then, on how mandation of carbon pricing is counterproductive. Judge, we think that when carbon pricing is mandated, these companies in underdeveloped or developing countries will be forced to do two things. First, which is to raise prices, and secondly, industries are likely going to use this carbon price as an easy way out. This gives proposition two direct major harms. One, understand that when these companies raise prices on a major scale in order to cancel their losses from the carbon pricing system, this is going to directly affect the consumers as well as a whole, especially for low-income groups. Also, note that consumers will now have to pay so much for them to get the exact same things. Look at inflation, Judge. We simply don't want to push this burden on these vulnerable actors as well, simply because large industries just don't want to pay for their reckless behavior in damaging the environment. So second, when this happens, carbon pricing will just become an easy solution for big companies to just escape the actual responsibility of taking care of the environment and push the responsibility to the consumers instead, making them the vulnerable actors that have to pay the price of their ignorance. We think then there will be no responsibility actually pushed to large or major companies, simply because proposition is going to be stuck in a corner. They could either, one, push the prices on carbon pricing up to actually make a tangible change, but in turn destroy all incentives for other countries to accept the policy because you're risking having a monopoly, or two, let it stay like the status quo and just allow big companies to pay their way out. So, Judge, in proposition's world, this is going to push the burden to the consumers instead to pay off their own like carbon debt, and for the sole reason that they have no other choice but to buy their products. So this literally takes down their entire case on principality, because no longer the company paying the debt is the citizens. Based on these grounds, you must oppose.
I thank the speaker for their speech. And to continue the case for the government, I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Please have 15 seconds.
Sure.
Okay. I will start in 3, 2.
Just a second. Could you clarify your POI preferences for everybody?
Okay. My POI preference is verbal POIs. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Go on.
Okay, I will start in 3, 2, 1. Awards do not change companies. Companies want to profit at the end of the day. I do not see solvency coming from side opposition, and the only thing they tell us is that carbon pricing still exists on their side. But I'm extremely unclear how their world is going to change. I'm extremely unclear how the environment will be saved on their side. My speech is extremely simple today. 2 responses. Number 1 on pollution, on the clarification on opt-in. Then after that, a pre-response on how pollution is likely to be a prerequisite to development. Now, firstly, on how consumers pay more. I'm not sure exactly why this is the case because we are not taxing them. We are simply capping them with existing green tax reliefs. You tell us, right, that when these initiatives are brought in, the consumers have to cover for these increases in prices because development costs money. But we tell you that the green tax reliefs in status quo still do exist. So it means when companies pivot to greener methods, there are likely to be tax reliefs for them. This looks like, for example, electric vehicles. Such companies are actually able to claim tax releases because they go through a more greener way. Second, on opt-in. We tell you on developed nations, right? They want to preserve their global reputation as environmental sustainability bastions. So they are likely to opt in because they want to remain their moral high ground, because they are these people who want to keep their reputation as environmentally friendly. Second, also because of international political pressure, because these countries are interconnected, they are likely to be in environmental pacts, they are likely to be in political pacts, which makes political pressure part of this as well. Also, we tell you that people on the ground are getting more woke about environmental policy. People are able to pressure the government into adopting such policies because people see that the environment is actually causing harm to them, because people see those videos on the internet. Oh, the polar bear is increasingly standing on a smaller block of ice. These are things that influence people on the ground to pressure the government. Now, in developing nations, we tell you it's twofold. Number one, how they're able to grow economically, because First has told you, right, that they are likely to enjoy higher profit margins compared to producing raw materials, because we tell you, right, they are able to sell their carbon credits to richer nations, to richer companies, because they are unlikely to use all the carbon credits. So now these carbon credits can be used as a token for them to gain leverage in the international trade and manufacturing market. Now, even if you do not buy that and believe that developing countries are anti-West, we tell you that the environment is a global issue. Insofar as everyone is placed with the same camp, which means that it's equal, all countries will want to solve the environmental issue. Also, people on the ground are increasingly buying into greener ideologies. It acts as a push towards the government to adopt the policy. I think you cannot simply take down this argument by saying that everybody is anti-West, because number one, the UN, which you'd say is the global regulator, is getting more seats from the Eastern countries. And also, if everybody is placed on the same field with transparency, which is that everybody has the exact same cap, everybody can sell their carbon credit at the same level, I do not understand why people will be anti-West, especially when the environment is a global issue, not a political issue. Now, moving on to my arguments. Why exactly are carbon credits good for all parties, which also does sort of tie back to opt-in? Number one, companies in developed nations, because they are forced to cap their emissions, right? They are likely to pivot to more sustainable methods of production. They are unlikely to continue their dirty factory production because now there is a cap, and if they go past it, they'll be fined, they'll be punished in all sorts of ways. Now, because right, the quantity they need to produce does not change. For example, a car factory, they forever need to produce the amount of cars. So if they want to keep their profit up, they must pivot to other ways. You cannot tell me that, oh, these companies will just die because the tax is super high, because the punishment is super high. They need to keep their profits up. They will pivot to better ways. And I tell you, right, this also does not harm the company because of existing green tax release that exists in status quo, which I talked about earlier in my speech. If people pivot to greener methods, they're actually able to enjoy green tax release, which is unlikely to harm these companies, because yes, although they spend more money in developing these technologies, they actually get tax relief in the process, which is unlikely to harm them. Now, second, on companies in developing countries, right? Because they are able to gain leverage towards richer companies in developed nations. Because companies will emit less carbon can opt to save credits for sale to bigger companies in the West. We tell you that carbon credits will be a highly scarce resource, making it highly valuable and expensive. It means that small companies in developing nations now can profit to high amounts. It is very simple. Because carbon credits are distributed based on your industry and based on how much you are likely to produce. For example, right, a random small startup in Asia is unlikely to finish all of its carbon credits compared to like Apple, who needs to produce millions and millions of Apple iPhones. So these companies in Asia are likely to be able to sell these carbon credits to Apple, which makes them actually profit and gain leverage over these companies. Now, why exactly is this leverage important? This leverage is important for more favorable policies, for more favorable investments, because now Apple is likely to favor these random companies around the world just so they're able to get a constant stream of carbon credits for them to be able to continue producing the iPhones. So we tell you here, it's a win-win situation here where companies in developed nations are actually forced to stop emissions, and these companies in smaller developing nations are actually able to sell these carbon credits to richer people. So how do these developing countries actually solve this environmental issue? Because we tell you, right, when they sell these carbon credits to richer nations, they actually profit a lot. And we tell you that profiting is a prerequisite to fixing the environment. We tell you that when these developing countries are able to profit, they are actually likely to pivot to greener options because there is political pressure, because they want to save the environment and they identify it as a global issue. So we tell you that insofar as we prove to you that these smaller countries actually gain from the sale of these carbon credit, they will actually pivot to greener options in the future. For example, here, Apple needs to produce many products, definitely more than a startup producing toys in Asia, which I've talked about earlier. This Asian company can now sell their carbon credits to Apple for profit. Apple, this small Asian company, now becomes increasingly important to the West and all those rich companies, which means that they have leverage over them. Now, even if opposition tell you, oh, rich companies will just continue to buy all carbon credits and continue polluting, we tell you two things. It is, number one, it is very expensive, which will severely disrupt profit margins, because this eventually forces MNCs to find better and cheaper alternatives for their sole goal of profit. And number two, we tell you we are fine with this in the short term, because PM has told you that carbon credits progressively get reduced. There will eventually not be enough carbon credits for them to keep buying and keep using. And number three, total emissions are still kept at a safe level. For example, if 10,000 tons a year is considered a safe amount and each company is allocated 10 tons, company A selling 8 tons to company B, making their allocation 18 does not matter, because when you add the two together, there are still 20 tons, the total output is still the same. The impact here is very clear. Number one, on how developing nations can eventually pivot to cleaner alternatives, and we allow developing nations this window to profit. Then after that, they're able to reach the end goal of complete environmental protection, because they're likely to adopt green technology when they actually have the financial resource to do it. The bottom line in this debate is simple. MNCs are forced to stop, while small companies in developing nations profit from the carbon credit allocation and actually are able to help their nations transit to a greener technology future and to a greener future. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their fine speech. Reminder to everybody to please offer POIs. We are having a exciting and engaging debate here, and I'd love to have all of you engage with each other a little bit more during speeches. That said, moving on back to the opposition, I call on the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Can I get a confirmation if I'm audible and visible?
Yep.
Okay, before I start, my name is Faye and my pronouns are she and her, and I'll be taking POIs verbally. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Imagine a world where companies can buy their way out of climate change, a world where green is just a marketing game. This is a chilling reality that could unfold if carbon pricing systems are not carefully designed and implemented, right? Which is why I'm so proud to stand on opposition. Firstly, on clarifications and strategic mistakes, we would like to reiterate our stance here. Note, Judge, that we have never been against the existence of carbon pricing, but simply the mandation of it, right? Its implementation on PROP's side of the house. So side PROP cannot simply assume that we're completely against carbon pricing as an ideology. But then secondly, side proposition has been assuming the best case on how these companies would integrate into carbon pricing well with the support from the government, right? Not realizing that this doesn't actually happen in our status quo. But done with that, let me move on to my first clash on principle. They mentioned how carbon pricing allows companies to take time and research before making investments, right? Making this more effective in combating climate change. Two responses under this panels. Firstly, while it's true that carbon pricing can give companies more time and research and plan their investments with the goal to combat climate change, this argument fails to consider the urgency of addressing climate change as a whole, right? Which I will be reiterating later on my weighing. But then secondly, many cost-effective emission reduction technologies and strategies already exist today. We believe that mandating this would simply become counterproductive, especially for smaller enterprises. But then secondly, they mention how companies will gain tax reliefs because they take on carbon pricing, making it a win-win. Note panels that this notion would only fly under the conditions of our status quo and not on their side of the house. If carbon pricing is mandated for all industries, then there's no longer a competitive advantage or special treatment for any individual company or sector, right? So the playing field is leveled, removing the justification for targeted tax reliefs. So what's the weighing here on our side panels? On our principle, we have told you several things. Firstly, how the reducing carbon footprint in essence shouldn't be incentivized through money and capitalistic driven approaches. But then secondly, we've talked about how the mandation of carbon pricing is inherently flawed because many developing or third world countries cannot afford carbon pricing and cleaner productions, right? Which is vividly mentioned by my LO. And ultimately, we believe that when carbon pricing is implemented without grounds and is enforced towards every sector, regardless of their circumstances, it would simply take away the authentic incentive to combat climate change. But also issues for those who cannot reduce their carbon emissions due to their inherent nature of their industries, which I will later be expanding. So what our side is pushing as a comparative is that companies will have the freedom to choose whether they want to implement this carbon pricing or not in regards to their industry and the circumstances they have. But before I move on, yes, I'll take that POI.
When we tell you that companies are already profit incentivized, you have to tell us what other incentives that they have to turn green, what other incentives they have to opt into green things. If not, you have no solvency in your side at all.
Okay, panels. What they have failed to acknowledge here is from the get-go, from what my LO has stated, is the alternative that we are pushing, right? We aim for the support and guidance from the government themselves, but not from the mandation and obligation that comes from what they're pushing here. But then moving on, panels, they mentioned how mandating this notion incentivizes these companies to implement carbon pricing and to understand the urgency of climate change themselves. But mandated policies alone do not necessarily lead to the genuine understanding and commitment to climate action, right? Companies may simply comply with regulations without internalizing the underlying environmental urgency. But then secondly, effective climate change action requires more than just pricing mechanisms. It also needs supportive policies, investments, and broad cultural behavioral shifts, which is something our side is for. But then they also mention how companies in developing nations can gain leverage because they can sell their carbon credit, right? Two responses under this panels. Firstly, note how this argument doesn't fly due to the wording of the motion that says all industries. Note that only a portion of industries would be able to benefit from this claim, right? But then secondly, developing nations often have less stringent emissions regulations and lower baseline of developed countries. This compared to developed countries, right? It can make it easier for their companies to generate carbon credits, potentially creating an unfair advantage businesses in more regulated markets. But moving on to our weighing in practical here. We want to explain to you why our competitive art of not enforcing carbon pricing is more effective. Note how our side pushes for a market flexibility. Companies might be more likely to innovate and find cost-effective ways to reduce emissions if they are not forced into regulatory framework. Moreover, the likelihood of company engaging in greenwashing activities, making superficial changes that appears environmentally friendly but have little real impact. But then secondly, when the notion of being sustainable under buying or selling permits of carbon outputs, it puts a burden on every enterprises to change the entirety of their company, from their methods, machinery, product, transportation, and so much more, ultimately costing more to sell. But when we talk about the nature of our status quo, we know that the two most dominant countries in sustainable practices include West and China, right? So with the availability of green technology and the advanced mechanisms, note that when this policy is implemented, it creates a culture of dependency towards these two countries, where we become more reliant on their technology and mimicking their practices. But done with that, let me forward my extension here. Note how carbon pricing at its core is not suitable for every industry. We would like to emphasize on how carbon pricing cannot be treated as a one-size-fits-all solution in combating climate change. Industries have vastly different carbon footprints and capabilities for reducing emissions. For instance, industries in manufacturing like cement and steel production have high carbon footprints due to the energy-intensive nature of their processes. While in the service sector, for example, including industries like hospitality or finance, generally has low carbon footprints. So implementing carbon pricing in these sectors might not be as impactful in reducing the overall emissions compared to the manufacturing sector, creating this large gap that ultimately undermines the very purpose of combating climate change, right? But then the burden of carbon pricing often falls disproportionately on smaller businesses. Largely, more established companies tend to have the resources and infrastructure to invest in green technologies and sustainable practices, making them better equipped to absorb the costs associated with carbon pricing. Smaller enterprises, however, often lack the financial capacity to implement these changes. This creates a significant barrier to entry and an unfair disadvantage from the get-go. Note that small businesses not being able to adhere to this policy already excludes a large chunk of demographic in every industry, right? Moreover, to add onto the burden side proposition, we are aware that mandating carbon pricing for smaller businesses while aiming to benefit the environment could inadvertently create an advantage for larger corporations. These larger companies often have the resources and infrastructure to readily adopt sustainable practices and technology, making them better positioned to make more sustainable approaches, right? For example, through green technology, eco-friendly packaging, and so much more. This could lead to a situation where larger companies gain a competitive edge, potentially widening the economic gap between them and the smaller businesses who struggle to keep up. Additionally, the carbon pricing system could be exploited by companies and individuals who prioritize profit over genuine emission reduction. This could lead to a situation where carbon credits are traded without meaningful environmental impact. Note that there's a large likelihood of the exploitation of it. Firstly, companies might engage in activities that appear to reduce emissions but minimal world impact. For example, a company might invest in energy efficiency measures that are already mandated by regulations, claiming credit for emissions reductions that would have happened anyway. So under all those reasons, panels, I'm so proud to stand on opposition. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank the speaker for that fine speech. And to conclude the main case for the government side, I call upon the government whip.
Am I audible? Hold on. Am I audible and visible? Okay, great.
Yes.
Hold on. Let me just set up my timer. And just let me check my microphone one more time. All right. Verbal POIs, don't put anything in chat. Verbal POIs and starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, what opposition case has been is just basically softlining, not engaging with the issue at hand here, and a lack of weight. Let's just move directly into the strategic observations because I'm just tired of having to deal with the lack of focus on strategy on their side. First of all, about how they're just softlining and not engaging with the issue that this debate proposes, right? They told you that they carbon pricing also exists on their side too, but realize that this is completely softlining because even if they manage to do so, if they're just going to be picking and choosing where you want this carbon pricing to be put at, and you have to realize that climate change is a global scale issue. It doesn't improve the world if only China has green technology, if only developing countries if developing countries who pollute more than China are still going to be continuing to pollute, there's no change, there's no sovereignty, there's no engagement, there's no mitigation or opposition because the impacts on their side are they were never analyzed. In other words, the carbon pricing that exists on their side is completely ineffective, and we tell that on their side they are not able to combat climate change whatsoever, right? Secondly, they haven't actually been able to weigh this motion properly, weigh their case properly, we think, because they just told you that the reason why our mechanism is somehow worse than their mechanism of government encouraging companies to like go green, is that apparently we are violating the principles of saving the environment. But we ask you, why are the principles of saving the environment more important than doing it practically? We think it doesn't matter how you're doing it, as long as you're one, not harming the people on the ground, and two, you manage to achieve your goal, aka like reducing climate change, both of which we have proved with one, our mechanism, and two, our argument respectively. Now moving into our responses then. Firstly, on how developing countries won't want to participate in this because of colonialism and exploitation, etc. Realize that the whole point of this environmental pact that exists on our side exclusively is to ensure just and sustainable eco-friendly policies to prevent any form of exploitation that might manifest on our side, right? We already told you from the first speaker setup already. We think that they just didn't listen to our speech. So what does this mean for developing countries? Rejected. It means they're incentivized to participate in this environmental pact to avoid becoming victims of exploitation. Therefore, this point from opposition no longer stands. Furthermore, we've already illustrated that these developing countries can get a leverage in international trade markets by selling their carbon permits to other countries and other companies. And in other words, they gain a larger benefit here on our side at the end of the day, because they're able to develop their own economies and their own communities to the point that they're able to actually transition into a green technology at the end of the day, which means that it is even more in favor of consumers, and they also get a benefit in economic growth and also manage to reduce the impacts of climate change that would affect them, right? This is so much more better than what opposition was trying to claim here. That is that they avoid exploitation, but realize that exploitation is going to happen on their side too when companies continue to just use the companies that they set up in developing countries. But realize that when smaller companies in developed countries need to buy these carbon permits from the companies in developing world, this exploitation is likely going to reduce, because these developing countries have leverage to say, oh, if you reduce the exploitation in our companies, we're going to be able to sell these carbon permits to you. Therefore, we tell you that on our side, we're still even able to reduce the exploitation even in our worst case, right? Now, secondly, on mandation on how like they say that mandation of carbon pricing causes a rise in prices. Before that, I'll take the POI.
If these companies are not going to hold principles, what will their incentive be to move forward with green technology when they can continue to benefit with more carbon emissions?
Yeah, but we're literally putting a carbon cap on them to ensure that they're no longer depending on the carbon emissions, and realize that they now, even if they don't really have any focus on principles, is that now they're being forced to be ethical and also be environmentally friendly because of our mechanism. Please make sense. So now, second response then about how we are going about how the mandation of carbon pricing causing a rise in prices is completely wrong. Because realize that's rejected is that there's a competition between companies that is going to prevent this from happening. Because companies are smart enough to know that other companies will take advantage of this increased price and strategy to use other strategies to offset the losses made due to transitioning into green energy. For example, by selling carbon permits, but also keeping their prices, their goods and services low, so that they can still compete with these other companies that have decided to increase their prices instead. So in other words, this is very unlikely because competition is going to prevent this, right? Now, thirdly, then, that they say that our comparative cannot accommodate for the urgency of climate change. First of all, we already told you that our comparative actually manages to combat climate change. We're not going to repeat this too much. We know that we have already proven it enough. Furthermore, their comparative is so incredibly illogical because they depend on companies being incentivized to go green by the government thus encouraging them. Two questions. First, what do you mean the government encourages them? Our side is also quote unquote encouraging them through mandating carbon pricing. So please illustrate it before moving on into another point. Where is your incentive for government to do so? Second of all, if only certain companies adopt carbon pricing, nothing will be done because it's not like America. It's the entire world that is producing carbon, and therefore your impact on your side is completely insignificant. Brother, principles is not something everyone have. Oh, okay, so now let's move on into our clashes here. The main clash here is about how climate change and green technology exploitation, how is it going to be best on our side? So why is this the most important clash in this debate? Realize that the whole point of climate change is to protect the well-being and people on the ground, right? So we tell that both developed countries and developing countries have an interest in this, because if they don't stop climate change, their cities